Hello folks, welcome to our second unit, Legal and Ethical Issues. This unit covers two of our course competencies, legal being one and ethical being the other, so we're taking a full 2 weeks to get through it. So this first week we'll focus more on legal, and next week we will talk about ethical issues. So now you may remember me saying last week that every unit in this course will have objectives. These objectives are part of the national curriculum, which we follow as an accredited educational program. Think fast. Do you remember from last week who our accrediting agencies are? If you're thinking the ARCSTSA and KHAP, then you're right. Nice job. These objectives give you a nice idea of what to expect from the unit and a good idea of what your takeaways should be as well. So take a moment now to pause the video, read through the objectives for this unit. What you'll notice is that the last two objectives having to do with documentation are italicized and underlined, and that's because you'll be covering documentation in your Intro to Surg Tech course later, so I won't be spending much time on it during this unit. So we're going to start out today by talking about HIPAA. HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it took effect after 2003. It requires you, as a health professional, to protect the privacy of and provide security for patient health information, and you have to be very careful. Here are some examples of HIPAA violation. Copying any portion of a patient chart, taking home patient chart materials, discussing patient health-related information in public areas or any patient-related information in public areas, telling family or friends about specific information from work, disclosing information about media trauma like school bus crash victims, a prisoner's condition following a crime, the condition of a known community member like the weatherman, the best way to keep people from prying and asking questions about confidential health information about their friends or their neighbors, even innocent questions like, hey, I saw an ambulance at our next door neighbor's house. Do you know if he's doing okay? The best way to keep people from asking those questions is just to deny that you have any knowledge of it at all. So the main purpose of HIPAA was to improve portability and continuity of health insurance coverage, to ensure privacy of health information, and to decrease fraud and abuse in healthcare. So with these new changes, they found that privacy of protected health information, otherwise known as PHI, would be compromised. So they incorporated privacy regulations as well. Think firewalls, anti-malware, and requiring strong passwords for security reasons. So HIPAA is a big deal, and there are real consequences for violating HIPAA. Civil penalties can reach up to $100 per violation and up to $25,000 per year. Criminal penalties can range between $50,000 and $250,000 depending on the nature of the violation. You can also lose your job or be removed from this program, so it pays to be careful. This includes social media. It's best not to post anything about clinical or work on social media. Western Technical College has removed students from their programs in the past for talking about their clinical rotations on social media, so just play it safe and don't say anything about your clinical rotations on social media. Many people across the country have also lost their jobs because they were indiscreet and shared protected health information on social media or elsewhere. It's just really not worth it. So, HIPAA protects the privacy of protected health information, but what is protected health information? It's any identifiable information that has to do with a person's health, healthcare, or their payment for healthcare. Some examples would be their name and address, birth date, social security number, any photos of the patient, medical record numbers, fax numbers, their email address, health plan beneficiary numbers, like on your insurance card, any account numbers, certificate or license numbers, vehicle identifiers or license plate numbers. So some examples of what you're not allowed or not inclusive. You're not allowed to access your own child's health info on the computer. Looking up birth dates, addresses, appointments, and test results for family, friends, and neighbors. So, like, your next door neighbor comes up to you and is like, oh, I had this test done and they called and left a message, but I wasn't home and I really want to know, can you just look on the computer and check and see what my test result was? Not okay. Or, if you're just curious, like, hey, I know my cousin went and had that ultrasound last week. I want to check and make sure she's doing okay. Also not okay. Reviewing a patient's record just out of concern or curiosity, like I said. Looking up a staff member's medical or financial information. Discussing patient information with your family and friends. Discussing patient information with staff when it's not related to your job or when you're not in a secure place. So like if you're if you're walking down the hallway on your way to lunch or you're in the elevator. Not okay. Not okay to review patient record and to use information in a personal relationship. Like, for example, to check out your ex-husband's new wife or their baby, something like that. Compiling a mailing list from hospital records for any reason except as defined by your job duties. So where people have run into problems with this is they say, I'm having a birthday party and I want to be able to invite everybody. So you look up the hospital records to find your great Aunt Edna's current address. Not okay. You need to call great Aunt Edna and get that address straight from her. Okay? So let's move on. Let's compare law with ethics, okay, so that there's less confusion. Laws apply to the population as a whole, whereas ethics govern a specific group of people. Healthcare providers follow both laws and ethics when they practice their profession. So generally, laws are designed to discourage behavior that may cause harm to other individuals. And ethics actually promote behavior that helps other people. So ethics may influence the creation of laws, but they are not actually enforceable by law. Ethics are standards of behaviors within groups, like religious groups, PETA, AST membership, things like that. So here are a few legal terms, and we're going to look at these a bit closer in the following slides. Okay, so we're going to be looking at law, liability, torts, and malpractice. Let's define law. Laws are society's standards. They're enacted and enforced by governments to protect all individuals and groups from harm. The definition comes from a different textbook that we actually have up in the lab for you to use if you should so choose. It's Fuller's Surgical Technology Principles and Practices. Your AST textbook breaks it down a bit further into different types of law, and we'll get to that in a minute. Violations to law result in consequences which are punitive in nature. As healthcare professionals, we have a responsibility to know and understand the laws that are surrounding our role. So, laws enable society to be peaceful, orderly, and cohesive. Let's talk about where laws come from. Constitutional laws are written into the U.S. Constitution. This is the supreme law of the land, and it trumps other types of law. Okay. Statutory laws are developed on the state level and signed by the state governor. They're prescribed by the action of a legislature. So this is why some things can be illegal in some states, but not in others. An example of this would be the State Nursing and Medical Practice Acts. Administrative law refers to the regulation of government agencies like OSHA or the FDA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they ensure safe working conditions. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, and they regulate food, drugs, and cosmetics in this country. Judicial law is also known as common law, and it is principles based on precedents. That is, principles that have been created by previous court decisions and act as examples for judges in the future. Each state has laws for licensed professions within the state. So if those laws are broken, the state licensing board may take action against the individual in addition to whatever criminal or civil consequences they might face. You might be thinking, but surgical techs aren't a licensed profession, and that's true. So let's take a look then at how legal boundaries are defined for the surgical technologist. Licensed professionals will find themselves in trouble if they violate their state practice acts. For unlicensed professionals like surgical techs, the boundaries are set by civil and criminal law. For example, it's illegal to act as a nurse without a license. So if a surgical tech practices as a nurse, they will be breaking the law. Even if a nursing task is delegated to a surgical tech and the surgical tech is appropriately supervised, the tech is liable for any negligence of criminal wrongdoing. So if they mess up, it's on them. Criminal offenses are considered to be acts against society. This is going to be the difference between criminal and civil law I keep talking about. So criminal offenses, like I said, are considered to be acts against society. So punishments for criminal offenses could include fines, jail, or both. Some examples would be robbery, murder, embezzlement, discrimination, etc. Civil law refers to wrongdoings between one person and another, as opposed to society as a whole. There may not have been any criminal laws broken, but the rights of one person were infringed upon by another person. Punishments are fines and are called damages. One example would be violating a person's privacy by accessing their medical record without official reason to do so, which would be a HIPAA violation, which we spoke about just a few slides ago. In addition to laws, surgical technologists and other health professionals will find themselves guided by hospital policies and procedures. Accredited hospitals and other healthcare facilities must provide all employees printed details of policies and procedures required by that facility. The facilities will update policies and procedures periodically as laws and practices change. So employees are made aware of these updates are made. It's your professional duty as a surgical tech and as an employee to stay current on those. So, what kinds of information will you find in your hospital policies and procedures? The policies will describe administrative and logistic operations. So this may include an organizational chart, which is a graph that looks almost like a family tree, and it demonstrates the structure and hierarchy of the hospital and how everything and everyone fits together. Other documents may include a chain of command and a description of the employee identification system, identification badges, for example, and when they're supposed to be worn. The privileges include things like vacation days, benefits, leave, wellness programs, etc. Information on salaries may include a low, median, and high salary range, for example, for particular positions, and also how starting salary is determined, whether it's based on schooling or experience or both, etc. The operating room procedure manual will describe safe practices for the OR in that specific institution. Types of procedures may include infection control, aseptic technique, disinfection, and sterilization of surgical instruments, room turnover between procedures, equipment data, and chemical information. So we're going to move on now and get into some more legal terminology that you should really know about. Delegation is the transfer of responsibility for an activity from one person to another. You can find that in page 10 of Surgical Technology Principles and Practices. That's your main textbook. There are limitations, though, to what may be delegated to a surgical tech. Make sure you know the practice acts in your state and also the policies in your specific facility. Typically, you cannot administer medications, even though you can prepare and deliver them to a surgeon for administration. You cannot count without an RN supervision, and what that's referring to is counting of sponges, needles, blades, instrumentation, because we count before and after the procedure. You cannot do patient assessments. You cannot perform invasive procedures. You cannot witness a surgical consent, and that's referring to the legal witness of the patient signing a consent form for the procedure to be performed. You cannot independently circulate in Wisconsin. That is, you cannot independently perform those nursing duties during a procedure in the OR. There are also conditions of delegation that must be met. The person must be legally permitted to perform the task, receive the proper training, and be competent to perform the task. So accountability in surgical technology refers to accepting responsibility for a task that you complete. The person who delegates a task retains accountability for it. However, all healthcare workers are expected to know their state practice acts and so are also accountable for any task that has been delegated to them. The short story on this is just because a task was delegated to you by the surgeon doesn't mean that he or she retains all the accountability for your actions. So don't accept a delegated task unless you're confident that it's within your skill set and you are willing to hold accountability for it as well. Liability is an obligation to do or not to do something. Corporate liability refers to the corporate body itself. So in criminal law, a corporation is liable for the actions or omissions of its employees. Personal liability refers specifically to the individual and their own actions. A tort is a civil wrong. Now remember, that means between one person and the next. That may be intentional or unintentional. Remember that civil means against one person or their property. So torts can be intentional or unintentional. I know this sounds repetitive, but it helps to repeat these things. So let's go a bit further into torts on the next few slides. So intentional torts are willful acts against another person. Some HIPAA violations fit into this category as a violation of privacy. Defamation is a statement that damages a person's reputation. Slander is verbal defamation, and libel is written defamation. Civil assault is a verbal threat that makes another person fearful. And civil battery often goes along with civil assault. Civil battery is actually touching another person without proper consent, whether harm is done or not. False imprisonment is illegal detention of a person without their consent. Unintentional torts are the most common form of liability. So negligence is an unintentional tort, is an omission or commission of an act that a reasonable and prudent individual would not do under the same conditions. Some examples of this in the OR would include retained objects or objects left in a body cavity, burns, falls, improper positioning, which could lead to patient injury, mistaken patient identity or operative site, improper specimen handling, and poor handling of medications. Abandonment is an example of an unintentional tort and could be as simple as stepping away from a patient before proper safety belts and other safety procedures have been put in place. Failure to communicate between healthcare professionals could also result in injury to the patient. Finally, loss or damage to a patient's property could be considered an unintentional tort. Malpractice is professional misconduct that results in harm to another person. Essentially, it's negligence committed by a professional. Negligence is the omission or commission of an act that a reasonable and prudent person would not do under the same conditions. 4 elements must be proven in order for negligence to be present. 1. A duty to the patient exists. A duty to the patient is initiated the moment that the patient receives treatment or care from a hospital or physician. 2. The duty was breached when a failure to meet the standard of care occurred. 3. The breach of duty resulted in damage to the patient. And 4. The breach of duty caused injury to the patient. If all 4 elements are not present, the courts may enact the legal doctrine res ipsa loquitur, which means the thing speaks for itself. We'll talk about the legal doctrines in a couple minutes. This one means the thing speaks for itself, which in this case means the harm obviously came from the action in question. When speaking about malpractice, the following terms come into play. Deposition is testimony under oath with only a court reporter instead of a judge. The plaintiff is the person bringing the suit, and the defendant is the person who's been accused of the crime. A subpoena is the court order that requires someone to appear for deposition, and the jury is a group of one's peers who decide the outcome of the case. Perjury is when a person intentionally lies under oath. The trial is when both parties present evidence to achieve a resolution or determine a person's guilt or innocence. So, moving on from malpractice terms, let's turn our attention to the legal doctrines I mentioned before. They were developed to help ensure accountability and responsibility. So first we have the doctrine of personal liability. This says that the health professional is liable for his or her own actions, even if an authority figure like a physician says that they will assume responsibility. The doctrine of respondeat superior is also called let the master answer. It says that the employer is responsible for the actions of his or her employees. The doctrine of the borrowed servant says that the one who's controlling the employee has greater liability than the one paying him. The surgeon does not have complete control over the acts of the perioperative patient team at all times. Examples are counts and mixing meds. The surgeon is liable only when he has the right to control and supervise the way in which the task is performed. The facility is the one who sets up the policies for counting, for med handling, things like that. The doctrine of res ipsa loquitur, also known as the thing speaks for itself, is used to prove negligence when all four elements of negligence are not present. And last but not least, the doctrine of foreseeability. As health professionals, the surgical team needs to be able to identify possible risks to the patient. This doctrine makes it possible to be held liable for failing to anticipate a risk to the patient. We'll round out this week's lecture by touching on these traditional principles of healthcare staff. Ego primo translates to the patient first, and coincidentally, this is the motto of the AST, the patient first. Primum non nocere translates to above all, do no harm. This is one you may have heard before. It's part of the Hippocratic Oath that's taken by physicians. Hope you're all having a nice week, and we'll see you soon.